Well, good afternoon, everybody. Afternoon, evening, morning, whenever this video finds you. It's been a while since we talked, so I've learned some new things that I wanted to share. So let's do that. So, some of you may or may not be aware that talking in this box is not my normal job. I'm actually a bit of a wheeler dealer, and something happened in the range of my business this week, or not this week, actually, this month, that has stuck with me. I've been trying to shake it off, and it's actually been correlated in my mind to something that I've observed happening in the world that's important to pay attention to, but more importantly, something you can affect. Hopefully to the good, but, well, I'll let you decide. So anyway, so one of the things I sell is lift chairs. There's a very large population of old folks that need lift chairs, and in many cases they need them last minute. So having them available is something that has served me well, and I continue to do that. We buy them in distressed states, clean them up, reupholster, a number of things. But the point is that it's a more reasonable solution than if they have to call and get a retail solution when they have an issue. So I was busy doing my thing in my shop, as I always do, and got a message on Messenger. Now, I'm one who's going to respond very quickly on Messenger, simply for, in all cases, really. In the case of business, I want to sell something right away. But in regard to personal interactions, I think it's pretty important to get back to people in a very timely manner. Pro tip here, if you've got people who are leaving unread or not responding for a day, they're not your people. Get rid of them. But that's just an editorial note. You can do with that what you like. So anyway, got a message inquiring about it, and some back and forth, and eventually I had received voicemail. I didn't get to the phone in time, and the voicemail was more or less requesting that they wanted to buy the chair, but they wanted to buy it that day, and it was already the morning, so, under normal circumstances, it wouldn't be my first choice, but I was able to make the transaction happen if we could bring things together. So I called the number. Now, when I called the number, I was greeted by not the voice of the person who left the message, a woman, but a man. Pretty meek, pretty mild. But when I called, he was a little unsure, but in further questioning him, he said, "Oh yes, must be my wife, and can she call you back?" And I more or less just said, "Hey, if you want, the message was you wanted it today. I'd like to put this to bed as soon as possible, so if she's in any way available, that would be great." So, humana. Eventually he was able to put me through to her, and it turns out she's with her caregiver. And in that conversation, though, initially, after identifying what we were about, she immediately, in a passive-aggressive way, scolded her husband as not having taken care of this himself, instead, making her take care of it. Which, on one hand, I do understand her point, but it was a pretty crappy way to talk about your husband to a perfect stranger talking to you about something you're going to buy. Anyway, I observed that you observe those kind of things in the world. It's kind of like when you walk into a room and something smells. You don't have to stay too long, so you have to live with it. So made the arrangements, loaded things up, and proceeded to go to their place in the middle of town, and in what turned out to be an apartment building. So we got to the apartment. It wasn't the most opulent apartment in the world, but it certainly wasn't the worst. The buzzer system was not working, so the husband came out, and he was a reasonably average-sized fellow, average height, slender build, looked pretty healthy, but he was soft-spoken. He helped us in the door, and we went to his down. Fortunately, it was on the first floor, didn't have to contend with the elevator, and I went to the apartment. Now, when you open the apartment, immediately I was greeted by a scene I've seen many times. A little bit of clutter, poorly lit, and of course the dilapidated chair at the end in view of the entranceway of the door. So wanted to be as efficient as possible. My son and I, he oftentimes helped me. We trucked the chair into the place and began setting it up. Now, this fellow just sort of hovered around the periphery, and we exchanged some small language in a pleasant way, and he was fine enough to deal with in that regard. And after we had set the chair up, it was then, I said, well, really, we should probably have your wife come try it out. I had no idea the state she would have been in, but for sure she must have been infirm in some way. And so he called her, and it was sort of reminiscent. There was a show when I was a kid on. It was called The Hilarious House of Frightenstein, and it was a variety show which was based around a Transylvania concept. So one of the segments was Igor visiting Dr. Pet Vet, who would bring in a different animal that week, and a dog or a cat or a canary, whatever. Igor would fall in love, and he would have to go and ask the sloth for permission to have the pet. So he would walk to the edge of the screen and say, Mr. Sloth, Mr. Sloth, Mr. Pet Vet is here with this lovely doggy, and I love him so much, and blah, 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 and, can I please have him? And, of course, the predictable thing, if you watch the show, was that Mr. Sloth would be like, sort of the same sound that the monsters on the old Hercules cartoon would make. So it was kind of like that. He called his wife, and we heard some grunting and groaning and not unpleasant sounds. And I expected that, but we just waited because really they should try out the chair. So in short order, she rounded the corner, and this woman was mid-60s, but oxygen tube to the nose, very obese, very heavy, overweight. The weight actually was the worst kind of weight you can carry because it all had gathered to the front, was hanging down to the floor, almost to the floor, maybe her knees. Thick legs. I felt really bad that she was in that state, but there's nothing I could do about it in that moment. So, made her way to the chair, and she scolded her husband a little bit as far as helping her, not asking, scolding, and sat in the chair, and we went back and forth, and she was actually quite pleasant to us, maybe because we're strangers, I don't know. But in the final analysis, it actually turned out that she was actually far larger than the chair needed. It was a big size chair, but she needed a custom solution, and it wasn't ideal. And to the point she couldn't recline properly, couldn't breathe properly. It was just not ideal. So while we were doing that, we put her out of the chair a couple of times, and again throughout the exchange, she shouted at her husband, and again he didn't. He just tried to help as much as he could, be as accommodating as he could. And he was empathetic to her physicality, but on the flip side, in my heart of hearts, it felt like it was abusive, for sure. And what was actually even more interesting is that after we determined the chair wouldn't work, I looked at the other chair that was there and looked at it for a bit, and actually I discovered that the cause of the chair malfunctioning was some of the seat foam had let go, and it was actually going to be a pretty inexpensive fix. And so I advised them there too, and chalked that one up to experience, and we were out the door. But the experience did remain with me. You see, that state that she was in and he was in and they were in did not happen overnight. That circumstance happened actually at one step at a time. You see, there was a time when they got together. He was probably, he was still a reasonably handsome man. When they got together, who knows how they met, but I'm sure she treated him well. I'm sure they exchanged pleasant words. I'm sure they had all of the trappings of initial romance, etc., etc. Whatever made them get married. I'm sure they lived some kind of a life together. But I'm also sure that at some point a harsh word was said and not rebuffed. An unfair action was taken. And not necessarily just from her, could have been from him as well, But I was only looking at the evidence of what I was looking or what I was witnessing in that moment. I'm very meek, beaten man with an overbearing wife whose mentality had become her physicality. Her ugliness, her internal ugliness, had translated into her physical form. And it was tragic. It was absolutely tragic. And it stayed with me because it was so completely unnecessary. You know, early on in their relationship, and I'm not going to say she or he is to blame, they're both to blame because at some point he didn't correct her, and at some point she didn't correct herself, and maybe there was things on the other end, but it just became a constellation of dysfunction, not unlike, I don't know, eating a bag of chips for breakfast, lunch, and supper. Pretty soon you're going to look like a bag of chips. Or, someone who smokes excessively, not being able to breathe. You've seen the people who are on, breathing machines, etc., etc. Or, someone who's very weak from too much drink, or even just a shitty attitude and attitude and outlook on the world can turn a person into a sour old person that, again, will show up in their physicality. And it's funny because even if they had corrected themselves, even 10 years ago, I'm sure she was already in decline 10 years ago, but even if there had been minor changes 10 years ago, she would not have been in the state that I witnessed them both in. And again, it just stuck with me as to what the cumulative effects are of choices that you actually know are wrong, but you just do them anyway because on some level you perceive them as being easier. So then I thought about when I was a child in our current world right now. So I was a teenager in the 80s. I was born in 71, and I experienced the bulk of my teen years in the 80s. And, people always talk about the 80s being a great time, Miami Vice and John Hughes movies and Rob Reiner movies and all the great music and all that kind of stuff. And I will agree, it was a fine time to live, etc., etc. But there was an infiltration that happened that we don't often look back at and go, oh yeah. So for example, I can remember in the family movies, invariably, like if you watch like the old Chevy Chase movies or the old Christmas movies, invariably at some point in the movie there'd be some chick who'd be topless for like 5 seconds. Or you'd see a little child who would use drop an F-bomb or speak really poorly. Or there'd be some other, just hardly there miscreant behavior, but the point, it was there. Madonna got big when I was 13, like a virgin and all that kind of stuff, it was so controversial, this slut who'd spent a decade getting piped out was now like a virgin again because of this new dude. And you can sure as heck bet that they weren't observing any chastity. At least in an honorable way between the two of them, the way she carried on. And that spilled out into other parts of society, and it just, then we had, in the 80s, Rock Hudson came out, and that was the first, oh, Rock Hudson, you can look up what Rock Hudson, what his thing was. And just a general march towards a decline, to the decline we have now, like the gender insanity that's going on now, the family insanity, the lack of the loss of parental control as edicted by the government. Yeah. And in the 80s, if you could have pulled out a TV set or a newspaper or even a podcast of what's going on now, like a current events podcast, and described it to the people in the 80s, they would have been like, you crazy. How could that ever happen? And here we are. Anyone my age we're all just shaking our head. I mean, yeah, my dad, when I was a kid, my dad didn't like my music as much, but there was still some stability in, church, family, and all that kind of stuff. But it was that slow erosion. Like the Bible says, a little yeast leavens the whole loaf. And so I oftentimes wonder about, so we look at it now, we look at all the stuff that's going on now. Could it become even worse? Or by the same token, can you create little goodnesses now that could, 30, 40 years from now, tip things back the other way as a conscientious effort? Because remember, all the little kids swearing, the tit shots, all that kind of stuff in the movies and the miscreant music and all that kind of stuff, there was an agenda, but good people didn't stand up and go, didn't stop it. Now, in a lot of my friends' households, that was not allowed. But in today, you can bet their children are embracing it, from their scrolling the weirdo stuff on Instagram to I had YouTube open the other day, and not in my signed in account, and the stuff that's being served up just generally is pretty ridiculous. But that's just I'm coming from a mindset of, healthy eating, healthy living, healthy thinking, all that kind of stuff. So what do? I mean, there are some of you who are watching this video who will go, oh, there's Rob spouting off again about how great he is. And this has nothing to do with me being how great I am. Sure, I eat healthy. I try to think healthy. I try to speak healthy. And I'm trying to do my part by putting something like this out so you can embrace some critical thought, because we don't have the circle fire anymore. You don't have the wise old elder you're going to go to and talk about the challenges of life. So, hopefully this will reach someone. Hopefully this will make some of my contemporaries watch it and go, oh yeah, maybe I should talk to my kids or my community about that kind of thing. And because change begins in here. You got to, I always say to people in regard to going to church, one of the big things problems I have with modern church is the lack of reverence. Everybody shows up in their cargo pants and they're looking like they should be, I don't know, they're one step above wearing their workwear that they paint their house with. And the example we pull from the Bible is that the Bible does say, come as you are, but be transformed. And when Christ returned, he was, white, pure, etc., etc. So we have an obligation, I believe, to be reverent, not only to God, but to each other, because, it's just like women these days are constantly complaining that when men show up on dates, they show up like they smell or they haven't combed their hair and things like that. And it makes them feel like crap, makes them feel not very valuable. Whereas we have an obligation to each other to be the best versions of ourselves so that we can enact goodness in all. That is a larger topic, though. But going back to this couple, as I said, even if they had made minor adjustments early on in their relationship, something happened and it just wasn't checked or stopped. And it ended at a point where, I'm fairly certain that fellow is going to be relieved when she's dead. And without speaking ill, just as a objective observation, that won't be long. And then he'll be a shell of a man, because he'll been living for no purpose other than just being enslaved. So anyway, I've rambled on a bit, but when you think about your life and how you're interacting with the world, I think it's very important to think about what you're eating, think about the kinds of things you're thinking about, the kinds of media you're exposing yourself to. If you're just sitting there scrolling all day, there's a reason you can't hardly get to sleep. I've been scrolling for 3 or 4 hours. Clearly it doesn't agree with your body, and why would you do things that don't agree with you? If anything you're doing makes you feel like garbage, you should stop. Now, I could say that about working out, and I personally don't advocate fanatical working out, but exercise in general, there's a reason after people do it for a while, they actually like it, because there's a conditioning that our body goes through that it's like when you start eating salad after having, when a kid, you ever notice when you were a kid, it was always, combos, fries and burgers. I can't remember the last time I had a McDonald's hamburger, give me a salad any day of the week, and I prefer it just because I've conditioned myself that way. And my body recognizes that as being a healthy choice. But when you're talking to people, do you feel like garbage when you're done? If so, why do you keep talking to them? Or why do you keep talking that way? And further to that, why do you keep talking to them and hanging out with them? You know, the beautiful thing, there's a lot of demonization going on about the internet as being, some big specter. I'm going to tell you right now, things like this exchange right now, I believe the internet is the hand of God of bringing people together. And me on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon, whenever you're watching this, me being able to share just this observation with you will cause you to think. Will cause you to think, and will cause you to think about your behaviors. You know, there's enough work that's been done now on how to live a decent life, how to have a good relationship with your spouse, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your children. It's kind of like if I want to cook a steak, I can just wing it, throw it in the pan. I do have some experience, but if I'd never cooked a steak before, I don't know. I'm gonna look up the way Gordon Ramsay cooks a steak because he's got 5 Michelin stars. You know, and I have, and it turns out really, really well. There's actually a lot of guys who cook steaks really well, and they've got slightly different tweaks, but at the end of the day, there's certain core ways to do it which never fail. So in regard to your relationships, there's enough people out there, clinicians and psychiatrists and things like that, who studied history and studied the way people work and study the way men and women work, that certain behaviors, this is the way it works. If you want to be successful in your relationships, that's the way it works. And it may not even be natural. I actually have a little kitty cat. I've posted him in my thing before. It's a new little kitty cat, and he was feral. I got a feeling he was raised out, but without people around, and he's just a little. All my cats have been hand fed from very little, but I got him when he was probably 3 or 4 months old, so more feral, and he's always got that sort of that wiggly wants to get away thing. But he comes around me and he wants to be pet, but as soon as I pet him, he withdraws and runs away because he doesn't understand that affection is what he wants. Doesn't know how to get it. Because essentially what will happen is I'll pick him up and I will hold him just for, a minute or two in a firm way. And I can tell he likes it because the purring increases. And as he gets a little older, and then I calmly set him down. I don't smack him or throw him away. But then I calmly set him down. And he is learning that his interactions with me are something he can trust. And then, unlike people who sometimes people have an ingrained feeling that they can't trust anyone, and they just get into a vicious circle of constant repeating cycles over and over again. And that's probably what happened in the case of this couple. I'm sure that lady, maybe she had relationships before that fellow, and I'm sure there was cycles of dysfunction in the whole family. But that little kitty cat, I just keep continuing to be consistent with him, and the purrs keep getting louder, and I'm seeing progress with him, and I'm very convinced because, animals don't have that intellect where they, where their animals don't really worry about tomorrow. They only worry about today and maybe the next little bit, especially if their biggest thing is a consistent food supply. But we as people, we can look at something like our behavior and look at how we're interacting with the world, and we can learn that we don't need to indulge in behaviors that really pay no dividend. They pay no dividend. When you talk poorly about someone, when you berate someone, when you're unfair to someone, either physically or emotionally, or if there's a knowing in all, and if you don't feel that knowing, maybe if your heart's been hardened, you can always pray to God and say, listen, hey God, can you make me aware of where I am failing? And you'll either feel it, or maybe someone will just tell you, and you'll have to be listening for that input. And even if your heart has been hardened not to see that input, if you ask to be open to receiving that information through a miraculous chain of events, you will receive that information. And the lucky part is that, especially in the case of my little kitty cat, he's in the company of people that love him and understand what he can be, and are not just going to smack him, throw him away, and send him to the pound or the Humane Society. And if you're around people that, I'm going to tell you right now that it is my feeling. So in regard to this couple I was mentioning, it is my feeling that that woman was harder on that man early on. And if at some point 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, she took herself under control and said, you know what? I am treating this man like garbage, then their life would have been totally different. But remember, he agreed to it too, because he's been in prison now. He is imprisoned by the situation, and he agreed to it. And so they both needed to look at that circumstance and say not only what they're willing to, how they're willing to behave, but what they're willing to tolerate from each other. And this applies to your intimate relationship, your employment, your customers, your family and friends, and yourself. So do yourself a favor. Analyze your actions and say, and really at the end of the day, is there any reason at all for not simply becoming the best version of yourself? Hope you folks have a good day, and I hope these words resonate. Feel free to comment below. Like, comment, and subscribe. Everybody says that. This isn't a career for me. This is just me sitting around the circle fire so far by myself, but maybe that would change. Thanks, folks.